Brother, whatever God promised you to do and told you to do it, you keep doing it because your expectation is not going to be cut off.
Bob Joyce was asked one question about Elvis. His answer shocked everyone. It wasn't a stadium. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't even a particularly significant Sunday at the small Pentecostal church tucked away in Benton, Arkansas, where a man named Bob Joyce had been preaching the gospel for years. The congregation that morning was the usual mix of familiar faces. Elderly couples who'd been attending for decades. Younger families settling into worn wooden pews. A handful of visitors drawn by curiosity they couldn't quite explain. The service had been ordinary in every measurable way. Hymns were sung. Scripture was read. Pastor Joyce delivered his sermon with the same gentle conviction he'd brought to that pulpit countless times before. And then came the moment that would send shockwaves across the internet and reignite a conspiracy theory that refused to die. During the informal Q&A session that followed, a woman in the third row raised her hand. She wasn't confrontational. Her voice didn't carry accusation or mockery. If anything, she sounded almost apologetic, like someone who knew they were about to cross a line but couldn't stop themselves from crossing it anyway. The question came out simply, directly, with the weight of something that had been building for years. Pastor Joyce, are you Elvis Presley? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but witnesses describe it as feeling much longer. Some congregation members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, suddenly alert in a way they hadn't been during the sermon. And Bob Joyce himself, this tall, broad-shouldered man, with features that bore an uncanny resemblance to an aged version of the king of rock and roll, paused in a way that seemed almost theatrical. His expression flickered with something difficult to read. Amusement, perhaps, or recognition, or the careful calculation of a man choosing his next words with extraordinary precision. What he said next wasn't a denial. It wasn't the dismissive laugh you might expect from someone confronted with an absurd accusation. Instead, his response carried a strange warmth, an almost playful ambiguity that gave believers exactly what they needed while offering skeptics just enough deniability to maintain their position. He acknowledged the question without truly answering it, speaking about identity and purpose and the curious ways God works in people's lives. And by the time he finished, half the room was more convinced than ever that they were sitting in the presence of a living legend, while the other half wondered if they'd just witnessed the most masterful deflection in modern history. Someone in that congregation had their phone recording. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Comment sections exploded with analysis, debate, and raw emotional reaction. Elvis fan groups that had spent decades parsing every alleged sighting and supposed piece of evidence suddenly had something new to obsess over, not a blurry photograph or second-hand account, but a direct question and an answer that seemed designed to keep the mystery alive. To understand why this moment mattered so profoundly, you have to understand who Bob Joyce is, or at least who he appears to be on the surface. He's led this small congregation for years, earning a reputation as a compassionate spiritual leader with a gift for connecting with his community. He sings gospel music with a voice that sends chills down the spines of anyone familiar with Elvis Presley's own gospel recordings. The timbre, the phrasing, the emotional depth, all of it echoes the man who recorded How Great Thou Art with such conviction that it won Grammy Awards. And then there's his appearance, the facial structure, the way he carries himself, the specific gestures he makes when he speaks or performs. Individually, each similarity could be dismissed as coincidence. Together they form a portrait that millions of people find impossible to ignore. Visitors arrive at his church from around the world. They sit in those pews not seeking salvation or spiritual guidance, but hoping for a glimpse of something they can't quite name. They watch his every movement. They record his sermons and upload them for others to analyze frame by frame. They've turned a humble Arkansas pastor into the centerpiece of one of the most persistent celebrity conspiracy theories ever conceived. And through it all, Bob Joyce continues his work. He preaches. He prays with those who need comfort. He sings hymns that move people to tears. He answers questions about faith and forgiveness and the nature of grace. But that one question, the question asked on that ordinary Sunday, hangs over everything like a shadow that refuses to fade. Because here's what nobody can explain. If Bob Joyce wanted to end the speculation, he could. A simple categorical denial, delivered with unmistakable finality, would go a long way toward quieting the noise. Instead, his answer that day seemed almost crafted to achieve the opposite effect. And the question that keeps investigators and believers and skeptics alike awake at night isn't just whether this small-town pastor is secretly the most famous entertainer who ever lived. It's why, if he isn't, he seems so determined to let the world keep wondering. Conspiracy theories are easy to dismiss when they rest on nothing but wishful thinking and blurry photographs. This one comes with receipts that make even the most hardened skeptics pause before laughing it off. The case for Bob Joyce being Elvis Presley isn't built on a single dramatic revelation, but rather on an accumulation of details so specific, so eerily aligned, that dismissing them requires almost as much faith as believing them. Start with the voice, because that's where most investigators begin, and where many find themselves unable to look away. Recordings of Bob Joyce singing gospel hymns have been placed side by side with Elvis Presley's legendary gospel performances from the 1960s and 1970s, and the similarities extend far beyond surface-level resemblance. Professional voice analysts and obsessive amateurs alike have identified identical vibrato patterns, the same distinctive breath control techniques, matching emotional phrasing on specific words that Elvis was known to deliver in his own peculiar way. These aren't generic similarities that could apply to any talented vocalist. They're fingerprints, vocal signatures that seem to belong to one specific throat, one specific soul. Bob Joyce has never claimed to be impersonating anyone. He insists he simply sings as himself, which raises an uncomfortable question. If he's not copying Elvis, why does he sound exactly like him? The physical parallels run just as deep. Accounting for the natural effects of aging, Joyce's facial structure maps onto Elvis Presley's with unsettling precision. The shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the way expressions move across his features, all of it suggests a continuity that photography experts and facial recognition enthusiasts have analyzed extensively. Beyond static appearance, there's the matter of how he moves. Joyce gestures during his sermons and performances in ways that mirror Elvis's documented mannerisms. The specific hand movements, the slight tilt of the head when making a point, the body language that seems borrowed from a man who spent decades commanding stages around the world. These aren't behaviors easily learned or imitated. They feel instinctive, automatic, as though they belong to muscle memory rather than conscious performance. Then there's the matter of knowledge. On multiple occasions, witnesses claim Bob Joyce has referenced obscure details about Elvis Presley's life, insider information about recording sessions, personal anecdotes, specific memories that only someone intimately familiar with that world would possess. Believers point to moments where Joyce has allegedly slipped, using phrases or making references that seem to belong to Memphis in 1975 rather than Arkansas in the present day. Skeptics argue this could be the result of extensive research or fan knowledge absorbed over decades, but believers counter that the spontaneous, casual way these details emerge suggests something deeper than memorization. The timeline adds another layer of intrigue that investigators find difficult to ignore. Bob Joyce's documented personal history begins in a strangely vague place, with limited verifiable records before a certain point that conveniently aligns with when Elvis Presley would have needed to establish a new identity. Gaps in documentation aren't uncommon for people of a certain generation, particularly those from rural backgrounds, but this particular gap has attracted intense scrutiny precisely because of what believers suggest it might be hiding. Perhaps most compelling is the symbolic weight of where Elvis might have chosen to disappear. His deep Christian faith was never a secret. Gospel music wasn't a side project for Elvis. It was the foundation of his soul, the genre he returned to whenever the pressures of fame became too heavy to bear. If a man wanted to escape the crushing machinery of celebrity while still serving something meaningful, while still singing the music that moved him most, we're better than a small Pentecostal congregation that values humility over spectacle. The church becomes not just a hiding place, but a kind of redemption, a chance to use his gifts for spiritual purposes rather than commercial ones. Every piece of evidence, examined in isolation, can be explained away. But believers don't examine these pieces in isolation. They see a mosaic voice, appearance, mannerisms, knowledge, timeline, location, that forms a portrait too coherent to dismiss as coincidence. And the question that haunts them isn't whether they're right or wrong. It's whether they're witnessing something the rest of the world refuses to see, something hiding in plain sight behind a pulpit in Arkansas, singing gospel hymns with a voice that sounds exactly like a ghost. The case against Bob Joyce being Elvis Presley isn't just strong, it's overwhelming by any conventional standard of evidence. Elvis Presley's death on August 16, 1977, was witnessed by multiple people who knew him intimately. Paramedics arrived at Graceland and attempted resuscitation. An autopsy was performed by medical professionals who documented their findings. A funeral was held with an open casket viewed by thousands of mourners who filed past to say their final goodbyes. The institutional weight of documentation, death certificates, medical records, eyewitness testimony from family members and staff, all points to a man who died in his bathroom at the age of 42, his body finally surrendering to years of prescription drug abuse and declining health. Elvis historians and Graceland officials have consistently and firmly rejected theories like the Bob Joyce phenomenon. Representatives of the Presley estate have pointed out the logical impossibilities that such a deception would require. Maintaining a false death for nearly 5 decades would involve the complicity of doctors, funeral home workers, family members, close friends, business associates, and government officials, a conspiracy so vast that its survival would border on miraculous. Beyond the practical challenges, there are financial realities that make the scenario even less plausible. The Elvis Presley estate generates hundreds of millions of dollars through licensing, tourism, and commercial ventures. If Elvis were alive, the legal complications surrounding inheritance, ownership, and contractual obligations would create chaos that no reasonable person would willingly invite. From a psychological perspective, the persistence of these theories reveals something important about human nature rather than hidden truths about celebrity deaths. We possess a deep-seated resistance to accepting that extraordinary people can die ordinary deaths. Our pattern recognition instincts actively seek connections, sometimes finding meaning where none exists. The grief that accompanies losing cultural icons doesn't process cleanly or completely. It lingers, searching for loopholes and second chances that might undo what cannot be undone. Bob Joyce may simply be a victim of this phenomenon, a man whose unfortunate resemblance to Elvis has transformed him into a canvas for collective longing he never asked to carry. There's an ethical dimension here that often goes unexplored in the excitement of investigation. If Bob Joyce is exactly who he claims to be, a pastor who happens to bear a striking resemblance to a dead rock star, then the constant scrutiny represents a kind of quiet violation. Every sermon he delivers gets dissected for hidden meanings. Every gesture is analyzed for unconscious tells. Every word he speaks is filtered through the assumption that he might be lying about his fundamental identity. He cannot simply exist as himself because the world has decided he must be someone else. There's cruelty embedded in that dynamic, even when it flows from a place of love and longing rather than malice. But perhaps the most important realization isn't about evidence or ethics at all. Perhaps the question of whether Bob Joyce is Elvis Presley matters less than what the question itself reveals about those asking it. The fact that millions of people desperately want this theory to be true, that they invest countless hours analyzing footage and comparing vocal patterns, speaks to something larger than conspiracy thinking. It speaks to an unfinished emotional relationship with a man who left before anyone was ready. Elvis didn't get a peaceful decline or a dignified farewell. He got a bathroom floor and a tabloid circus and decades of exploitation of his memory. The fantasy of him secretly alive, quietly serving God in a small Arkansas church, offers a kind of retroactive redemption, a chance to believe that the story ended differently than it appeared. When that woman asked Bob Joyce if he was Elvis Presley, and when his answer rippled across the internet, the shock people felt wasn't really about what he said. It was about what they already believed before he opened his mouth. They came to that question carrying decades of grief, nostalgia, and hope that never fully died. His response simply gave those feelings permission to surface. And that's the uncomfortable truth hiding inside this entire phenomenon. The mystery everyone is trying to solve might not be about the identity of a small-town pastor at all. It might be about why we still need Elvis Presley so badly that we'll see him anywhere we look. Bob Joyce still preaches every Sunday. The church in Benton, Arkansas remains modest in size, but has grown strange in reputation, drawing visitors from continents away who sit quietly in wooden pews and study the man at the pulpit with an intensity that has nothing to do with Scripture. Some come once and never return, satisfied or disappointed by whatever they witnessed. Others become regulars, making pilgrimages that their families don't fully understand. And through it all, Pastor Joyce continues his work with a patience that borders on supernatural, greeting strangers who clearly came looking for Elvis with the same warmth he extends to lifelong congregation members seeking genuine spiritual guidance. Those who have spent time with him describe a man seemingly at peace with a controversy he never invited. He doesn't chase cameras or court publicity. He doesn't sell merchandise or capitalize on his resemblance to the king of rock and roll. He simply shows up, week after week, delivering sermons about grace and redemption and the mysteries of faith, while the world outside argues endlessly about who he really is. There's something almost poetic about that consistency, as though he's determined to let his actions speak regardless of what theories swirl around his identity. Over the years, Joyce has made various statements that believers and skeptics parse with equal intensity. He has never explicitly claimed to be Elvis Presley, a declaration that would invite legal scrutiny, media frenzy, and challenges he clearly has no interest in facing. but he has also never issued the kind of categorical, unambiguous denial that would permanently end the speculation. This middle ground, this careful ambiguity, is either the behavior of a man protecting an impossible secret, or the strategy of someone who understands that mystery attracts attention his ministry might otherwise never receive. Both interpretations remain valid precisely because neither can be definitively proven. What this phenomenon reveals about Elvis Presley's legacy transcends any individual theory about a pastor in Arkansas. Nearly 5 decades after his documented death, Elvis remains so vital in the cultural imagination that people genuinely believe he might have orchestrated the most elaborate disappearance in entertainment history. Consider how remarkable that is. Presidents fade from collective memory within years of leaving office. Scientists who changed human understanding become footnotes in textbooks. Musicians who dominated their eras become nostalgic curiosities for aging fan bases. But Elvis endures, not merely as a historical figure to be studied, but as a living possibility that the heart refuses to abandon. The connection fans feel to Elvis was never ordinary celebrity admiration. His vulnerability was too visible, his struggles too public, his humanity too raw for the typical distance between star and audience. People didn't simply enjoy Elvis Presley's music. They worried about him. They wanted to protect him from the forces that seemed to be consuming him. They felt personally invested in his happiness in ways that transcended any reasonable parasocial relationship. That kind of love doesn't accept death gracefully. It searches for loopholes. It finds gospel-singing pastors in small southern churches and wonders if maybe, just maybe, the story had a different ending than the one history recorded. The question asked of Bob Joyce that day forced everyone who heard his response to confront what they truly believe. Not about Elvis, but about loss and hope and the stories we construct to make grief bearable. His answer shocked people because it functioned as a mirror, reflecting back not facts but feelings. What they saw wasn't a dead rock star or a small-town pastor. They saw themselves, still waiting at Graceland gates that exist more in the heart than on any map, still not ready to say goodbye. Whether Elvis Presley is alive at 90, living quietly under a different name while leading a congregation in prayer, or resting in the meditation garden where thousands pay respects each year, the truth is that his presence hasn't diminished. Every time someone asks if Bob Joyce is Elvis, every time a new theory surfaces, every time a teenager discovers Suspicious Minds and asks who that singer was, Elvis walks back into the room. He sits down, he stays a while. And perhaps that's the only answer that truly matters. Elvis Presley, in every way that touches hearts and shapes memories, never really left at all. What do you believe? Is Bob Joyce carrying a secret that will follow him to the grave? Or is he simply a man caught in the crossfire of our collective grief? Share your theory in the comments below. And if Elvis's story still moves you, subscribe, we're just getting started.